Why is everyone missing weight lately? At a certain point, making weight for every single one of your fights was seen as a badge of honor, but at this point, when you look at each and every fight card that has been coming up lately, there's been so many examples of fighters just missing weight, and a question that some of you may be wondering is why is this happening? But quickly, before we get the video started, my name is JuicyMMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, as only 10% of you watching are actually subscribed. And also, if you guys want the inside scoop and extra breakdowns you won't see anywhere else, hit that join button, where members get exclusive videos, members only live streams, and other fun perks like badges and emojis as well. But anyways, let's get into it. Weight cutting was a part of MMA and combat sports in general forever. Fighters needed to cut weight in order to meet their opponent at a specific weight class, and that essentially made everything fair, at least in the eyes of the fighting commissions back in the day. But as time has progressed, a lot of these fighters, both in boxing and MMA, realized that the more weight they can cut, the bigger advantage they would have over their opponents. And when you look at the current UFC roster, there's a ton of examples of this, like DDP, RDR, or even Islam Makhachev at 155. All three of those guys were or are clearly too big for the specific weight class that they're at, but the reason why they're willing to cut so much weight is they have a natural advantage over their opponents at that specific weight class. But when you talk about a lot of fighters lately missing weight, you would think it would be one of those guys, like RDR, DDP, Michael Morales, Islam Makhachev, one of those guys that are cutting a ton of weight. But when you look at the reality, a lot of the fighters that are missing weight lately are guys that have been fighting at that specific weight class forever. So a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why are we seeing this? Why are we seeing so many fighters miss weight lately? Well, in my opinion, I think this comes down to a couple different factors, but the first and main factor I want to touch upon is a lack of incentive. Because if you're missing weight by 3, 4, or 5 pounds, you most likely have an advantage over your opponent because you're not cutting as much weight. And for the majority of fights, when a guy misses weight, the fight usually still goes ahead, because either the other fighter themselves want to continue staying on the card and want to continue with the fight that was initially scheduled, or if the fighter doesn't want to stay on the card and doesn't want to continue with the fight, the UFC will pressure them to accept the fight. And we see this a lot. There's been a ton of examples of this where the UFC is pushing specific fighters to accept fights against their opponents even if they miss weight by quite a bit. So I guess my point is, yes, every fighter is trying to make weight, but if you're a fighter, a lower level fighter that isn't getting paid all that much and your weight cut is becoming very difficult, why not just miss weight? Because at that point you have an advantage over your opponent because you're not cutting as much weight as your opponent did, but also on top of that, more than likely the fight is probably still going to continue. So now all of a sudden, yes, you did have to take 30% of your purse and pay it to your opponent, but at the same time you have a natural advantage over your opponent and you're giving yourself a better chance and a better opportunity to win. And let's be honest, most of these lower level UFC fighters aren't getting paid that much anyway, so taking away 30% of an otherwise pretty low amount of money purse probably isn't as big of a deal for them as compared to somebody who's making $1 million a fight. And also when you consider the fact that lower level fighter is also getting a natural advantage over their opponent, I think that's a trade-off that a lot of fighters would accept, and I think that's something that we've been seeing as of late. So overall, I do think the lack of incentive for some of these lower level or newer UFC fighters is a big reason for why we're starting to see a lot of these fighters miss weight as of late. Because on the contrary, when you talk about guys that are contending for the belt, champions, or even fighters that are soon to be contending for the belt, we don't see those sort of fighters miss weight nearly as much because they have a lot more to lose. There's much more of an incentive for them to make weight. If you're fighting for the belt or if you're the champion and you miss weight, you can't retain the belt or you can't win the belt in that sort of a fight, which is obviously a huge incentive. But even for guys that aren't fighting in championship fights, but they're fighting in number one contenders fights, they're making a lot more money at that point compared to somebody who just made it to the UFC. So they also have a significant incentive because they would be giving away a lot of money in that sort of scenario. And also on top of that, it's not an amazing look to miss weight at that stage of your career. If you're earlier on in your career and you miss weight but you put on a great performance and you get a fantastic win, the UFC kind of looks the other way in those sort of scenarios a lot of the time. But if you're talking about championship fights, number one contender fights, or any sort of high profile fight, the UFC certainly cares more about fighters making weight in those sort of scenarios. But the next factor I want to touch upon for why I think a lot more fighters are missing weight as of late is due to a mentality change. Because when you look in the past and you talk about particular fighters like Conor McGregor, Max Holloway, Dustin Poirier, even Justin Gaethje to an extent, those guys really prided themselves in making weight every single time, in particular Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor. And I think at the time there's a real trickle-down effect, because a lot of these fighters saw the guys at the top, like Conor, like Dustin, like Max Holloway, like Justin Gaethje to an extent, were all making weight each and every time, and they really prided themselves each and every fight to make weight, even if it was a difficult weight cut. And I think that in turn put a lot more pressure on a lot of other additional fighters to make weight, because they didn't want to seem unprofessional. But at this point, because we are seeing this more and more, guys miss weight, and guys miss weight by a lot, I think it's becoming more and more accepted amongst a lot of different fighters. Now, as I said, I do think all these fighters are trying to make weight, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make and the difference that I'm trying to make between back in the day and now is guys back then were more likely to push through difficult weight cuts and just make weight, or even miss weight by a little bit. But at this point, I think we're starting to see more and more examples of not only guys missing weight, but also guys missing weight by quite a bit. There's been a lot of examples of that as of late, just this year, honestly. So overall, I do think the UFC has a problem on their hands. When you essentially look at every single card, there's at least one fighter on a card that misses weight, and sometimes these fighters even miss weight by quite a bit. So as an MMA fan, it's kind of frustrating going into each and every card not knowing if certain fighters are going to make weight and not knowing if certain fights are going to continue ahead, because a particular fighter may not be super professional and they may miss weight. So a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, what do I think the solution is? Well, in my opinion, I don't think any solution, one way or the other, will completely eliminate weight misses. When you're cutting weight, and especially when you're cutting a lot of weight, that's just a part of the game. Certain fighters are going to miss weight occasionally. But at the same time, I think there's a couple things the UFC can do to further incentivize their fighters to make weight, especially their lower level fighters. And the first and most obvious thing the UFC can do is stop incentivizing and stop forcing their fighters to accept fights when their opponents miss weight. As I said before, this happens all the time, and if the UFC stopped this practice, I do think it would incentivize fighters to make weight, because as I said before, a big incentive for why certain fighters are missing weight is because for the most part, the fight is probably going to continue forward. But if the UFC isn't forcing certain fighters to accept fights against their opponents that miss weight, I do think the likelihood of fights continuing forward after a particular fighter misses weight is going to go down. And at that point, I think it would just incentivize fighters to make weight a little bit more than what it currently is. But also on top of that, I think another thing that the UFC can do is take away 50% of the purse of the fighter that misses weight as compared to 30%, which is what it currently is. At that point, it would be a higher incentive. The fighter would be losing even more money than they do currently, and it would just essentially force fighters to make weight. And to that argument, I get it. Some fans may say fighters don't make that much money anyway, why would you take additional money away from them? And to that, I would respond with, well, why not just give the additional money to the fighter's opponent? The fighter that missed weight is already getting an advantage going into the fight, so why shouldn't his opponent get even more of his purse, from 30% to 50%? I think those are two easy things the UFC can do to further incentivize fighters making weight. As I said before, even though solutions are not going to completely eliminate weight misses, it's just going to happen. It's a part of the sport. But at the same time, I think there are opportunities out there to incentivize fighters to make weight a little bit more than what it currently is. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Why do you think fighters are missing weight in your opinion? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.